So how exactly does a rebellion become a republic? I mean, it's a messy journey, right? It's filled with radical ideas, really bitter conflicts, and, well, a few flawed first drafts. Today, we're going to trace that wild path from the Declaration of Independence all the way to the U.S. Constitution. And we're going to discover how Georgia, one of the youngest and most vulnerable colonies, ended up playing this surprisingly crucial part in shaping the entire nation.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll dive into the idea of independence itself, which was, frankly, audacious. Then, we'll look at what was really happening on the ground in Georgia. It was messy. After that, we'll check out America's first and totally failed government. We'll see the crisis that forced a complete do-over. And finally, we'll get to the moment where Georgia's delegates stepped up and changed everything. So let's start with problem number one: tyranny. The colonists felt like their rights were just being trampled by a king thousands of miles away. And their solution? It wasn't just another protest or some negotiation. No, this was a complete and total break, a Declaration of Independence that was going to change the world.
The document they wrote it's a masterclass in how to make an argument. It's built in three simple parts. First up, the preamble. This is where they lay out the big idea. Hey, all people have certain rights. Step two, the grievances. This is basically the receipt list, a long, detailed breakdown of every single way King George III violated those rights. And finally, the declaration, the logical conclusion. Since you did all this, we're out.
Now you gotta understand, this wasn't just some flowery, poetic language. This was a bombshell. We're talking about a world run by kings and queens who claimed God gave them the right to rule. So the idea that rights were unalienable, that you were just born with them, was incredibly revolutionary. This was the whole philosophical core of their argument.
And actually putting your name on this document, that was the ultimate gamble. 3 guys from Georgia, Button Gwinnett, Lyman Hall, and George Walton, made the trip to Philadelphia to sign it. And let's be crystal clear here, what they were doing was treason. If this whole revolution thing failed, they weren't just going to prison. They were going to be executed. They were literally signing their own death warrants. But while these men are up in Philadelphia making history, the vibe back home in Georgia was complicated. The revolution here wasn't some glorious unified charge. It was a nasty civil war, pitting neighbor against neighbor. So you basically had 2 camps. On one side, the Patriots, or the Liberty Boys, who were all in on independence, and on the other, the Loyalists, or Tories, who wanted to stay British. And here's the kicker. In Georgia, the Loyalists actually outnumbered the Patriots. Why? Well, Georgia was the youngest colony. A lot of folks there were doing pretty well under the king, and they relied on British soldiers for protection. For them, revolution wasn't exciting. It was terrifying. And you can see this division play out in the actual fighting. It was brutal. In 1778, the British actually recaptured Savannah. That made Georgia the only colony to be taken back by the Crown during the war. There was a big Patriot win at Kettle Creek in 79 that gave everyone a little hope, but then came a totally crushing defeat at the Siege of Savannah. In fact, the British held on to that city for almost the rest of the war. And the scale of that defeat? It's just staggering. The sources call it a dismal failure, and this chart really shows you why. Just look at the numbers. Over 800 Allied troops, that's the French and the Patriots, were killed. And on the British side, 18. That's not just a loss, it's an absolute disaster. It really shows you how tough the fight was in the South. But hey, despite huge setbacks like the Siege of Savannah, the colonies actually win the war. And winning created a whole new problem. How do you build a government for people who just, overthrew their last government? Their number one fear was creating a new king. So their first attempt was this thing called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles were America's first shot at a constitution, and they were designed, on purpose, to be incredibly weak. I mean, after everything with King George, the founders were terrified of a strong central government. So they wanted to keep all the real power with the individual states, and the national government was almost an afterthought. And this quote from the Articles really gets to the heart of it: a firm league of friendship. Think about that language. Not a country, not a nation, a friendship league. It was way more like an alliance of 13 little independent countries that just kind of agreed to work together, sometimes. Now, to be fair, the government wasn't totally useless. It could handle the big picture stuff, like foreign policy, declare war, sign treaties, send ambassadors. And it could run some basic services like coining money and making a post office. So it kind of looked like a government, but it was missing some key ingredients.
And yeah, here's the catch. It couldn't do the things a government really needs to do. It couldn't tax anyone, so it had no money, ever. It couldn't regulate trade, so you had states putting tariffs on each other and basically having little trade wars. And crucially, there was no president to enforce the laws and no court system to interpret them. It was a government with absolutely no teeth. So, yeah, it didn't take long for pretty much everyone to realize this whole League of Friendship thing was a disaster. The government was broke, the states were fighting, and the whole country was just falling apart. The founders knew it was time to go back to the drawing board. This table really connects the dots perfectly. You can just draw a straight line from the problem to the result. No power to tax? Well, the government was broke. No trade regulation? States started fighting each other. Every state gets one vote. Big states like Virginia felt totally ripped off. And you needed a unanimous vote to change anything? That meant the system was basically impossible to fix. So in 1787, delegates from the states all get together in Philadelphia. Now, their official job was just to tweak the Articles of Confederation, but they got into that room and pretty quickly realized that a few patches weren't going to cut it. They had to throw the whole thing in the trash and start over, from scratch, this time to build a government that would actually last. And it's right here, in the middle of a hot, stuffy Philadelphia summer, that Georgia's delegates step onto center stage. They're about to make two very different but equally huge contributions to the new Constitution.
First, let's talk about this guy, Abraham Baldwin. He wasn't even born in Georgia. He was a transplant from Connecticut. He's a lawyer representing Georgia, and he's about to cast a vote that will literally save the entire Constitutional Convention from falling apart.
So here's the situation. The whole convention is deadlocked. It's the big states versus the small states. The big states, like Virginia, are saying, hey, we have more people, we should get more votes in Congress. The small states, like Delaware, are terrified of being ignored, and they're demanding every state gets an equal vote. And nobody was backing down. The whole thing was about to implode. So what does Abraham Baldwin do? Georgia had been voting with the large states, but Baldwin deliberately changes his vote to create a perfect tie. And that tie, it was like hitting the brakes on a runaway train. It broke the fever in the room, and it forced everyone to stop, take a breath, and form a committee to actually hammer out a solution. And that solution became known as the Great Compromise. And that compromise was brilliant. It's the same system we have today, a two-house legislature. The Senate is where the small states got their wish, equal representation, 2 senators for every state. And in the House of Representatives, the large states got what they wanted, representation based on population. Now, Baldwin didn't invent this idea, but his bold vote broke the stalemate and made it possible. But Georgia's contribution wasn't all heroic. There's a much darker side. The delegates from Georgia, along with other southern states, fought hard to make sure enslaved people were counted as part of their population for representation. This led to the infamous 3/5 compromise, which dehumanized enslaved people by counting them as 3/5 of a person. This awful decision gave the South way more power in Congress for decades and baked the poison of slavery deep into the foundation of the new government. So you think about it. The founders' first attempt at a perpetual union lasted a mere 13 years. Their second attempt, the Constitution, which was born from both brilliant compromise and this tragic, terrible concession, has now lasted for over 2 centuries. And it leaves us with this final, really important question. What does it actually take for a union, especially one designed by imperfect people in a divided time, to truly endure?